Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us here on CNBC Africa. What role do you see for development finance institutions in accelerating the journey of regional integration?
Thank you. Can I first of all tell you that in 1964, when the African Development Bank was being created, this was the first mission the bank was given. In fact, this was the reason for its creation. Because you recall at the time, the founding fathers of the then Organization of African Unity agreed to keep colonial borders as inherited, inconvenient as they were. But at the same time, they decided that economic integration of these Balkanized countries was absolutely fundamental for economic development of the continent. So our role is to make that happen by removing the physical barriers to trade, to movement of capital and people. So that is building things, highways, power pools, centers of excellence, that kind of stuff. And then also helping in building the institutions necessary for that to happen. And then also helping in removing non-physical barriers. So we're active on all the three fronts, and we spend about 20% of all our commitments for this kind of activities.
As you've already noted, the idea of regional integration is not new. We're not here to make a case for regional integration, it seems. But it seems as if we're here to make a case for implementation. What would you say accounts for the less than desirable pace that we've seen thus far?
First of all, it is variable across Africa. Some regions have done extremely well. I think the star performer in this is the East African community, which is far advanced. And in terms of their own roadmap, they're doing quite well. I think this whole region, COMESA, bit of SADC, I would say things are moving in the right direction. Where we're having really challenges are in North Africa and the Central African region. They're behind schedule. So I would not say Africa is lagging behind on the agenda. I would say you have got variable speed across the continent. And on some issues which matter for all of us, I'm disappointed by the lack of execution, and I'll give you just one. Everyone, I included, complain about the cost of travel within Africa, the difficulties of connecting one region to another. If you want to go to the Sahel now, as I'm doing, the chances are to go through zigzag routes. The cost of flying in Africa is still very high, maybe 40% higher than they should be. But we have an agreement since many years called the Yamoussoukro Agreement to deregulate, partially at least, the aviation sector. So you can attract more investments and drive down the cost of travel. It has not happened. That should happen. It does not require any money. It does not require a new policy decision. It requires implementation of the decision. Now, why is it not happening? So many reasons. National airlines want to keep the share of the cake. Some countries want to keep the flag carriers. And I think it is those kind of things we should try and overcome for the benefit of the African economy.
Mr. President, what it sounds like to me is that there seems to be a bit of a blockage in terms of balancing national interests with the long-term gains that can be reached from regional focus and regional opportunities. How do you think governments should be approaching this trade-off game?
Economic integration is not a zero-sum game. I don't think it's a you win, I lose. It is we share a bit of our sovereignty and all of us win in the long term. So if you're looking at a solution whereby all of us would win, it is economic integration. And the example I give you is the COMESA region, which in a space of a decade, trade volumes have gone from $2 billion to $22 billion because of opening up borders, single border posts, movement of people. And I think every member country of COMESA has gained. You know, I recall I was finance minister of my country way back, and we were trying to lower the tariffs. At the time, I would say the average tariff was around 30%. And as members of COMESA, we wanted to lower those barriers. Now, the immediate fear was we shall lose revenue. Yeah. Because many of these countries depend on customs revenue. But we decided that in the overall interest of the region, we would actually lower the tariffs to an average of about 15%. Believe me, we actually got an increase in revenues from the increased activity in the economy, which we collected from the VAT and other revenues like excise. So actually the fear that you lose money was not justified. The same things for countries who have decided to open borders to other Africans. The fear that you'll get criminals in, you'll get the influx of immigrants is sometimes actually exaggerated. And so I think it is not a zero-sum game. Yeah. That is the whole point.
Of course, understanding that the bank dedicates a big chunk of its funding towards infrastructure projects in particular. Let's look at how we bring in the private sector to unlock some of those opportunities and take into consideration the fact that Africa competes with other parts of the world to attract capital. What more should governments be doing to make sure that private sector is on board?
Let me take you back to the early 90s. In the early 90s, the telecommunication sector in Africa was largely state-dominated. People are saying, okay, if you liberalize telecommunication, you have security problems, you have rent seekers, that kind of thing. And then the sector was deregulated, and there was an explosion. Today, the fastest growing region of the world on the telecom sector is the African continent. Look at all these undersea cables in the Indian Ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean. This is private money. I strongly believe that the next to come will be energy. Private people, private companies are waiting to invest in the energy sector. The impediments to that happening are policies in the energy sector. So the reforms of public utilities like ESCOM, the reforms of tariffs, having independent regulators who are independent, not simply on paper. This is what gives confidence to private operators to sign long-term power purchase agreements with national utilities, and then we see an explosion in the energy sector. So to answer your question, I think the reforms in particular sectors to ensure that private people will get the security they need, the return they need. Remember, these people are fiduciaries. They're not the Red Cross. They're not coming in because you want infrastructure. Right. They're looking for opportunities for their shareholders.
They want to turn on you.
Precisely. So you must make it possible for that to happen, and that is what I would like to encourage.
Of course, when we look at the Africa growth story now, it seems as if a lot of it is still predicated on mineral resources. And yet we know that the literature says that we should be diversifying our economies. How should African countries be approaching this? Because it doesn't seem as if we are reducing our dependence on primary commodities.
Well, you have a point, but nuance it a bit. My country has no oil, has no gas, very few minerals. Ethiopia has no oil, no gas. Kenya until recently had no oil, no gas. But these are some of the fastest growing countries in the region. So it can't be because of oil and gas. I think it's a constellation of policies attracting FDI. So the natural resource thing should be put into context. There are indeed countries where natural resources are driving growth, and there are early indications of the famous Dutch disease, resource curse. But I do think that in the current growth story, what your commodities, natural resources will account for more than 30%. 30%. The rest is services. Look at your own economy in South Africa, unless my figures are wrong. Huh? Probably 65% of all employment and above come from the services sector, not the mining sector. I think GDP of South Africa, and I have to check these numbers, probably in the same neighborhood, comes from the services sector. So you look at the FDI, in recent years in Africa, there have been a lot flowing to natural resources, the extractives, but a lot too in the services sector, and now we're beginning to see a bit in agribusiness. So I agree with you that in some countries, the growth story is linked to natural resources, but not everywhere, and certainly not the African average.
Of course, you've touched on South Africa, and I'm sure you've had ample opportunity to yourself integrate the National Development Plan, which is the country's economic blueprint for the next 5 years. Your views on how robust this plan is?
I think the NDP is an excellent document. I've seen many such plans in my responsibilities. This is one of the best I've seen. It has everything in there, from the premises, the roadmap, the benchmarks, the things which have to be done in different consideration, all there. You know, a plan has to balance many things, and it has. I think the acid test for South Africa would be whether that plan is implemented. Because as a friend of mine likes to say, you should never confuse an action plan with an action. This plan is very good, but I think now South Africans must get down to implement it, because all the solutions are there.
So it seems as if we've also got quite a strong political will to ensure that this plan is implemented, but we've also heard voices that are not happy with certain elements of the plan and saying it's a bit leftist. What's your view on that?
Well, you know, every policy document will have some critics. I think they should be listened to. It does mean they're right. But it means that for a living document like the national plan, as you begin to implement it, over time you'll see things which you need to fine-tune, to change hand there. And so the contribution of the critics is useful. But I don't think it calls into question the fundamental correctness of what this plan articulates.
Back, of course, we've chatting to the president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Donald Kubereka, and we're about to launch into his insights of leadership on the continent. Mr. President, thank you again for making the time to talk to us. What is your view of the leadership capacity we have in Africa at this time?
Well, two views. I don't know what to call leaders, because for me, I think leadership applies at all levels. Political leaders, business leaders, trade union leaders, religious leaders, civil society. I think we should not confuse leadership with top political leadership. We're all leaders where we are. And I want to put you that all of us have a role to play. There's too much finger pointing to the top leaders, as if all of us are shaking away our own responsibilities. So I do think that the answer to that is each of us has a role, and each of us must play their part. But if you want to point on the top leadership of this continent, I really don't think it's different from another part of the world. I want to tell you that I've been around since the G20 group was created. I think when the G20 was created, there was very strong leadership there. There was an agency to resolve global economic issues. But I think over time, we're losing that. Over time, in different parts of the world, I think the kind of leadership we need to resolve the issues of the world today is a bit lacking. Whether it is getting the Doha round on trade, the climate deal, whether resolving the migration issues, I think we need strong leadership in the world at large at this time. So the idea that somehow African leaders are a different breed from global leaders, I don't buy. I think that we need leadership now everywhere, because the problems the world is facing are real and they're urgent. And again, I want to put you that we're all leaders, me and you included.
Let's look at the fact that as you are about to hand over the baton and many of your peers, you're looking to see a new kind of African leaders take to the stage that are going to be able to deal with a new economic world order, the new complex challenges that face the African continent now. What does that person look like to you?
First of all, to the issues. 50 years after the Organization of African Unity, and then African Union was created. It has been a long march. Same for the bank. We shall be celebrating 50 years next year. I think a lot has happened, but now we need to go to the next level with a new generation of leaders. And Africa has huge talent in this area. So we're looking for leaders who will be transformational to take our continent to the next level, taking advantage of its big strengths, which are its demographics, its young people, looking at the opportunities in leapfrogging technology, looking at these huge discoveries of natural resources, being inspired by what's going on in the world at this time. And I hope and believe that the new generation of leaders coming up will be able to take us to that next stage, which is the transformation of the continent. Because economic growth is fine. We need it. In the 80s, 90s, this continent was getting poorer. The increase in population growth was higher than increase in economic growth. So we're getting poorer as a continent up to 2000. Then 2000, a corner was turned. Suddenly the economies were growing faster than population increase. But we're still at what? 5%. Not good enough. Yeah. Not good enough. If you have 5%, this is what is happening. If your population is growing at 2%, you have inflation of 3%, that is 5%. So per capita income increase, very small. So we need to go a bit faster, 7%, 8%, 9%, double digits. The kind of thing you are seeing now in Ethiopia and a few other countries. So we're looking for leaders who will take us to that next level, the level of transformation.
Let's look at the conundrum that these leaders are likely to take on when they realize 10% and double-digit growth broadly, and then trying to reverse the trend of jobless growth that we've seen on the continent. What strategies do you think they're going to have to adopt and run with to ensure that we break the cycle?
First of all, I don't buy the idea that it's jobless growth. And the target, the price is income. And in countries where economic growth is not correlated with the growth in incomes, there will be two issues. We have to deal with issues of inequality. Latin America used to be the most unequal continent for a long time. We have now inherited that price. We're now the most unequal continent. That has to be addressed by public policy. Policies of education, small businesses, gender equality, safety nets, the tools are well known. The second thing we have to do is to address the whole issues of how we manage natural resources. Because jobless growth is very common in countries who have found huge amount of gas, of oil. You have got movement of labor from sectors like agriculture. So agricultural productivity declines. So farmers get poorer. The country imports food from abroad. So in those kind of countries, transferring that wealth into the agricultural sector, into small businesses, into education, that is the way you create jobs, because this is where they are. That's what will enable you to join the global value chains instead of simply making money from rents, from this manna from heaven. So we have the tools. The toolbox is not complete, but I think we have enough knowledge of how to accompany growth with jobs.
Let's look at the skills conundrum, if we may. How do we ensure that this bulging demographic that you've referred to benefits from the economic story that is unfolding on the continent?
That's a real problem. You raise a big issue there. We'll have to come to it through multiple angles. I think the first angle will be to invest in education, but ensuring that the outputs are commensurate with the investment. Because far too often you have targeted the number of people in schools, enrollments and so on. But a study was done in, I think it was in Mali, some time back, in secondary schools, and found that a good share, maybe 24%, of secondary school graduates could not read or write. I was in Tunisia during the time of the revolution, where I had these so-called university graduates who could not find jobs. The reality was some of them were actually unemployable in the sense that there's a skill mismatch between what they have as qualifications and what the private sector wants. In almost every African country, South Africa included, my own included, we have this thing called the missing middle. You're looking for people who get things done. So you have got top people, top PhDs in philosophy and law and economics. You have top engineers. You have honorary workers, but in between, people who get things done. Private sector in every country is competing for them. Electricians, people who know marine technology, people who can repair things. There's a missing middle everywhere. So I think we need to address qualitative entry education. We need to address this missing middle, the kind of things Germans do very well. Right. That thing, for me, is a priority, and is a priority for the bank at the moment. That would be a very good start. Now, there's a whole range of other things we have to do to ensure that children or poor people get into quality education as well. Because you don't want to create islands like happened in a few Latin American countries. But the issue you raise is fundamentally important.
I think we've spoken a lot about the continent, and I think it's a good time for me to ask you now, what's your vision for Africa? Where do you see this continent going?
I tell you what, the vision for Africa was decided when the NEPAD program was put in place. African leaders put on the table what the vision of Africa should be. Whether it is stability, whether it is economics, whether it is institutions, governance, it is all there. There was even a mechanism in place called the peer review to ensure that we encourage each other to adopt best practices. So I adhere totally to that vision of Africa as defined by them, as defined by the African Union. That is a vision which I understand. But me personally, I think that if we can be part of the implementation of that vision, you and I and everyone else, that is what be more important. And I think for some countries, we're on the way. For far too long, this continent has been defined by a narrative which is perhaps a distortion of this continent. What is your image of Africa reading some of the newspapers? A 14-year-old with a Kalashnikov, a begging mother for her children, refugees, all kinds of problems. But you find all these things in many other parts of the world. But somehow, we have allowed this to define our continent. And part of our struggle, all of us, is to redefine this, the narrative. To say, it's not all rosy, but it's not all what is often described by the press. The begging continent, every summit, people meet, what shall we do for Africa? So, as President Obama said when he was in Cape Town, in Dar es Salaam, this is a time to look at Africa with another lens. This is a place where you have got opportunities. You've got tons of problems, human, economic, and so on. But now I've also tons of opportunities. And I think our challenge is to make that happen as we also alter the narrative which has described it for too long.
Talking about narratives, of course, there's one narrative that you have complete control over, and that's your own. What's next on the cards?
Look, next on the cards is for me to implement what I'm doing now. I have 2 years into my job. We have just adopted a new 10-year strategy of inclusion, of sustainability. That is top on my agenda. Because people put me in this job expecting me to deliver. And that is what I'm focusing on at the moment. When my term is over, when I've handed over to my successors, then I will decide what else to do. I think this continent has so many things which all of us are called upon to contribute in our small ways. And I'm sure there'll be a way in which I can contribute to the prosperity of this continent. But I'll come to that bridge when time comes.
Mr. President, thank you so much for making the time to talk to